She was 6 months pregnant when the phone call came. Her husband had been shot in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, and by the time she reached his side, there was very little anyone could do. Within hours, the country's grief would belong to everyone, splashed across every front page in America, replayed on every television, set in every living room. But the 10 children she already had, and the 11th still growing inside her, belonged only to her. Before we move forward, subscribe to the channel now. Nobody handed Ethel Kennedy a manual for what came next. There was no framework anywhere for raising 11 children alone under that particular kind of public weight. No other family in American history that had lost a husband and a brother-in-law to assassination within the same 5 years, both of them men the entire country had once imagined as its future. She simply had to figure it out day by day in front of cameras that never fully stopped watching. One of them would die alone in a hotel room before he turned 30. One of them would die on a ski slope months after a scandal the whole country had already read about. One of them would spend 2 terms as the first woman ever elected to statewide office in her state. One of them would end up 6 decades later running one of the largest departments in the entire United States government, and would become one of the most argued about people in American politics doing it. And one of them, the youngest, wouldn't be born until 6 months after her father was already gone, growing up as the only one of the 11 who never had a single memory of him at all. Their names were Kathleen, Joseph, Robert, David, Courtney, Michael, Carrie, Christopher, Matthew, Douglas, and Rory. The 11 children of Ethel and Robert F. Kennedy. Let's start with the 2 the family lost first, because in a strange way, everything that came after in this family, every choice the other 9 made about how visible or how private to become, was shaped at least in part by what happened to these 2. Before any of that, it's worth understanding the household these 11 children were actually raised in. Ethel Skakel had married Robert Kennedy in 1950, the daughter of a self-made coal and coke fortune out of Chicago, a family every bit as wealthy as the Kennedys, but without the same decades of political ambition behind it. By most accounts, she was the livelier, more spontaneous half of that marriage. The one who filled Hickory Hill, their sprawling Virginia estate, with dogs, horses, and a constant rotating cast of children's friends, athletes, and political figures passing through for touch football games on the front lawn. Robert Kennedy served as his brother's attorney general, then won his own Senate seat from New York, building toward what many people at the time assumed would eventually be a run for the presidency himself. That run came in 1968. He was in the middle of winning the California primary when he was shot in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles, dying roughly 26 hours later. Ethel was 39 years old, 6 months pregnant, and suddenly the sole parent of what would become 11 children. The oldest not yet 17 and the youngest not yet born. People close to the family have said she made a deliberate decision in the years that followed never to let her own grief become the household's dominant emotion, insisting on sports, laughter, and constant activity at Hickory Hill, even in the rawest early months after the assassination. Whether that approach helped or simply delayed a reckoning that arrived later for some of her children is something even people close to the family still debate. David Anthony Kennedy was 13 years old, watching a television in a hotel room when the news broke that his father had been shot. By most accounts, something in him never fully recovered from that moment. He had already, as a much younger boy, watched an earlier assassination unfold in the family's world, that of his uncle. By the time he was a teenager, people close to the family have said he had already begun experimenting with drugs, first quietly, then in ways that became harder and harder to hide. He spent years in and out of rehabilitation programs. Friends and family members have described him as someone who is deeply loved, genuinely funny, and in real pain for most of his adult life, a combination that people who knew him say made his decline both easier to overlook and harder to watch once it became impossible to ignore. His younger brother Robert has since spoken about their relationship as an unusually close one. Describing David at times as something like his best friend inside a large and complicated family, the two of them bound together by struggles neither could fully talk about with anyone outside their own circle. By his early 20s, David's drug use had already become serious enough that it once led to a near-fatal heart complication. The kind of medical scare that in a quieter family might have forced a genuine turning point. In this one, it became simply one more crisis folded into a decade already full of them. People close to the family have said Ethel never stopped trying to reach him, never stopped pushing treatment, never stopped hoping the next program would be the one that finally held. In April of 1984, David was in Palm Beach for a family Easter gathering. By most accounts, he was asked to leave the family compound that weekend because he was intoxicated and behaving erratically, a detail that, decades later, still reads as almost unbearably sad given what came next. He checked into a hotel a short distance away. Several days later, on the morning of April 25th, a hotel secretary knocked on his door, got no answer, and let herself in with a passkey. She found both beds made. She found David between them. He was 28 years old. The medical examiner would later determine a combination of substances in his system, the kind of finding that, at the time, forced an entire family to reckon publicly with something they had spent years trying to manage privately. His mother had already called the hotel that morning in a panic, worried he'd missed his flight home. When the hotel called her back, before anyone said a word, she reportedly asked simply, "He's dead, isn't he?" and hung up the phone. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. A mother who had already buried a husband to violence, now confronting the death of a son to something quieter, slower, and in its own way just as merciless. Just over 13 years later, the family would bury a second child. Michael Lemoyne Kennedy had, for most of his adult life, looked like the sibling most likely to build a real political career of his own. He'd managed his uncle Ted Kennedy's successful re-election campaign. He'd served as his older brother Joseph's closest political advisor. People who worked alongside him described a sharp, capable operator, exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes talent every political family needs and rarely produces twice. Then, in the spring of 1997, that reputation collapsed almost overnight. It became public that Michael had, years earlier, been involved with his family's babysitter, a relationship that had begun when she was a young teenager. No criminal charges were ultimately filed, in part because the young woman and her family declined to cooperate with investigators, wanting to protect her from the exact kind of exposure that followed anyway. Michael issued a public apology at the time, saying he hoped his wife, his children, and the young woman's family could someday forgive him, and that he intended to do everything he could to earn back their trust. The fallout reached far beyond Michael himself. His marriage to Victoria Gifford, daughter of the broadcaster Frank Gifford, ended in separation that same year. The scandal effectively finished his own political future, and by most accounts it contributed directly to his brother Joseph's decision to abandon a run for governor of Massachusetts that same year, a race Joseph had long been considered a frontrunner to win. For a family that measured its bad years on its own particular scale, 1997 was already shaping up to be a difficult one, before it got dramatically worse. Then, on New Year's Eve of 1997, while on a family ski trip in Aspen, Colorado, Michael was playing a football game on the slopes with several relatives, a game the resort's own ski patrol had reportedly warned the family against more than once that day. He collided with a tree. He was pronounced dead within the hour. He was 39 years old. Two brothers, one collapse into addiction and one very public fall from grace, both ending far too early in the span of 13 years. Ethel Kennedy would go on to raise 9 more children into adulthood, and by every account, she never let either loss define how she treated the ones who remained. But if David and Michael's stories were the ones that ended soonest, Kathleen's was the one that, in many ways, opened the door for everyone who came after her. Kathleen Hartington Kennedy was born on the 4th of July, 1951, the first of the 11, arriving 3 years before Robert Kennedy would even be elected to public office himself. She grew up, by most accounts, with a front-row seat to the family's rise, old enough to remember her father's Senate campaigns and her uncle's presidency in ways her younger siblings simply couldn't. She studied at Harvard, then went on to law school in New Mexico, a path that, unlike her father's, took her a fair distance from the expected Kennedy trajectory of Massachusetts politics before she circled back toward public service. In the 1990s, she ran for and won the office of Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, serving 2 full terms between 1995 and 2003, the first woman ever elected to that statewide position. She married David Lee Townsend and raised 4 daughters with him, Maeve, Carrie, Rose, and Meehan, each of whom would go on to carry a piece of the family's public service instinct forward in her own way. As lieutenant governor, she focused much of her work on issues tied to at-risk youth and community reinvestment, the kind of unglamorous policy work that rarely generates headlines, but that colleagues at the time described as genuinely central to her time in office. She later ran for governor of Maryland herself in 2002 and lost, a rare electoral setback for a family that had, for decades, treated Massachusetts and its neighboring states as something close to home turf. One of the harder chapters in Kathleen's life came years later when her daughter Maeve died young, a loss that once again put the Kennedy family's long and painful history with early death back into headlines the family never asked for. It was a loss that echoed, in its own way, the same pattern the family had already lived through twice with David and Michael a generation earlier. Sudden, public, and impossible to grieve privately. Kathleen herself has largely stepped back from the daily churn of politics in recent years, though she remains connected to family philanthropic causes and occasionally speaks publicly on issues tied to her father's legacy. Of all 11 children, she is in many ways the one who most directly picked up the exact baton her parents were holding: elected office, public service, a life spent, at least for a stretch, inside the machinery her father helped build. Her younger brother took a version of that same path, but his would end up somewhere far messier. Joseph Patrick Kennedy II was the second of the 11, born in 1952, and for a long stretch of his adult life, he looked like the sibling most likely to eventually occupy his father's old Senate seat. He founded Citizens Energy Corporation in the years after his father's death, a nonprofit that provided discounted heating oil to low-income families across the Northeast during brutal winters. A genuinely practical piece of philanthropy that outlasted his own time in the spotlight and that his brother Michael would later help run. He went on to serve 12 years in Congress representing Massachusetts from 1987 to 1999, and for a long stretch he was considered one of the frontrunners for governor of the state. The kind of race that, had it gone differently, might have put a second Kennedy in that office within a single generation. His personal life, though, generated a different kind of headline entirely. His first marriage, to Sheila Rauch, lasted 12 years and produced twin sons. After their civil divorce in 1991, Joseph sought and quietly received a Catholic Church annulment of the marriage, a process that, in the eyes of the Church, doesn't simply end a marriage, but declares it never sacramentally existed in the first place. Meaning that in the eyes of the Church, the marriage that had produced his own 2 sons was ruled to have never truly happened at all. Rauch didn't learn about the annulment until 1996, 3 years after Joseph had already remarried within the Church to a former congressional aide. Stunned by what she called the hypocrisy of the entire process, she spent the next year fighting the ruling and eventually responded by writing a book, Shattered Faith, publicly and sharply criticizing both her ex-husband and the Church's process, arguing that the Kennedy family's influence had helped push the annulment through with unusual speed. The controversy became national news just as Joseph was weighing a run for governor, and by most accounts it contributed directly to his decision to abandon those plans. Then, in a final twist almost nobody expected, word came out roughly a decade later that the Vatican had quietly reversed the original annulment after Rauch's own appeal to Rome finally succeeded. "I'm very grateful that the marriage was validated," she told reporters at the time, noting that the original ruling had ignored a marriage she considered to have been real, happy, and lasting, at least for a while. It was, in its own strange way, a second public vindication for a woman who had spent most of a decade insisting on exactly that point. Joseph has largely stayed out of elected office since, though he's remained active in business and in causes tied to the family's charitable legacy. It's the kind of complicated, deeply personal history that rarely makes it into the polished version of this family's story, but it was very real for the people who lived through it. No sibling's public life, though, would eventually stir more disagreement across the entire country than the third child, the one who became, decades later, one of the most talked about members of an American president's cabinet. Robert Francis Kennedy Jr., the third child, spent the first several decades of his adult life as an environmental lawyer, starting in the mid-1980s with the nonprofit Riverkeeper before co-founding the broader Waterkeeper Alliance and turning it, over more than 2 decades as its president, into one of the largest clean water advocacy networks in the world, with volunteer chapters eventually spread across dozens of countries. By most accounts, that work earned him real respect inside the environmental movement long before most of the country knew much else about him, built through hundreds of legal actions against polluters and municipalities that were failing to meet basic water quality standards. He's also spoken openly for years about his own long battle with heroin addiction. A struggle, he says, stretched across roughly 14 years of his life before he got sober, one he has said he overcame with help from cousins inside his own extended family. It's a detail that gives an unusually direct human weight to what happened to his brother David just months after Robert himself had gotten clean, a loss he has since described as one of the harder ones of his life. Years later, when Robert was nominated for his current cabinet position, a cousin of his, Caroline Kennedy, publicly urged lawmakers to reject the nomination, saying he had led other family members toward addiction himself, a rare and pointed public disagreement playing out between 2 branches of the same extended family. In the 2010s, his public profile shifted again, this time toward increasingly public disagreements with mainstream health authorities over vaccine safety, positions that drew sharp criticism from many public health experts and, eventually, from members of his own family. In 2023, he broke from the Democratic Party entirely, announcing an independent run for President of the United States. That campaign eventually ended with an endorsement of Donald Trump, and in early 2025, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was sworn in as the 26th Secretary of Health and Human Services. In that role, he has pushed a wide-reaching agenda under the banner Make America Healthy Again, touching everything from removing petroleum-based food dyes from the food supply to updated federal dietary guidelines to a significant restructuring of the department's budget and staffing, one that has reduced the agency's workforce and reshaped several of its component health agencies. Supporters point to his focus on nutrition education in medical schools and his attention to chronic disease as long overdue conversations that mainstream health policy had ignored for decades. Critics, including members of Congress who have questioned him directly in hearings, have focused instead on rising rates of vaccine-preventable illness, changes to the recommended childhood vaccine schedule, and cuts to research funding and public health programs during his tenure. His own cousin, Caroline Kennedy, was among the family members who publicly opposed his nomination before he was confirmed. Reasonable people, by any honest account, remain sharply divided on how his time in that office should ultimately be judged, and that division has only grown louder the longer he has held the job. Of all 11 children, his is the path that has put the Kennedy name back into daily American headlines more than any siblings since their father's own time in public life. While one brother became, by any measure, a lightning rod, several of his siblings built their adult lives almost entirely away from that kind of attention, each finding a quieter version of the same instinct toward public service their parents had. Mary Courtney Kennedy, the 5th child, spent years working for the foundation carrying her father's name before her personal life briefly became its own headline. She had been previously married in 1980 to a television sports producer, a marriage that ended after roughly a decade. In 1993, she married Paul Michael Hill, an Irishman who had spent 15 years in prison as one of the wrongly convicted Guildford Four, a group falsely tied to a deadly 1974 pub bombing in England, a case that had become one of the most notorious miscarriages of justice in modern British legal history and the subject of an Academy Award-nominated film. Ethel Kennedy herself had reportedly introduced the two after Hill testified before Congress about his case, and the couple married in a private ceremony aboard a yacht in the Aegean Sea. The marriage produced a daughter, Saoirse, whose name means freedom in Irish, before the marriage itself eventually ended. Courtney has largely kept her adult life since then away from public view, remaining connected to human rights causes tied to Ireland and to her mother's broader legacy. Her younger sister, Mary Carey Kennedy, built a career almost entirely around the family's human rights work, eventually leading the organization now known as Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, the same cause her mother helped found in the months after her father's assassination. Carey has spent decades traveling to conflict zones and advocating for political prisoners around the world, writing and speaking extensively on human rights issues, by most accounts carrying forward the specific piece of her parents' legacy that centers on human dignity rather than electoral politics. Her own marriage, to a man who would go on to become governor of New York years later, ended in divorce back in the mid-2000s, one more personal chapter that played out under more public scrutiny than most people's divorces ever do. Christopher George Kennedy, the eighth child, moved to Illinois in the mid-1980s to learn the food distribution business from the ground up, working a job well outside anything resembling the family's usual East Coast political territory. He eventually ran Chicago's Merchandise Mart, one of the largest commercial buildings in the world, and later chaired the University of Illinois Board of Trustees. In 2018, he ran for governor of Illinois in the Democratic primary, campaigning on the argument that the state needed fundamental change rather than incremental fixes. He ultimately lost the nomination, but he's remained involved in anti-hunger philanthropy in Chicago since, co-running a nonprofit food distribution effort with his wife, a quieter continuation of the family's charitable instinct outside the spotlight of national politics. Matthew Maxwell Taylor Kennedy, the ninth child, is by most accounts the sibling who has stayed furthest from public reporting of any kind, a genuinely private adult life almost entirely absent from the family's usual media footprint, a choice that, in a family this large and this visible, is arguably its own quiet form of rebellion. Douglas Harriman Kennedy built a career as a television journalist, working for years as a correspondent. In January of 2012, he became the subject of an unusual news story of his own, when he was charged with misdemeanor harassment and child endangerment after a physical altercation with nurses at a New York hospital who were trying to stop him from taking his 2-day-old newborn son outside without medical clearance. The case went to trial later that year, with nurses testifying that Kennedy had knocked one of them to the floor and twisted another's arm while trying to leave the maternity ward. Kennedy and his wife maintained throughout that the allegations were absurd and that he was simply trying to get his infant some fresh air, and he was acquitted of all charges the following year after a judge sided with the defense. It's the kind of strange, briefly viral news story that could have happened to anyone, but happened in this family's case to make national headlines simply because of the last name attached to it. And Rory Kennedy, the youngest of the 11, born 6 months after her father's death and the only one of them who never knew him at all, became a documentary filmmaker. And, by most accounts, one of the more accomplished ones working today, with more than 30 films to her name across 3 decades of work. Her films have covered subjects ranging from the abuse of detainees at Abu Ghraib prison to the final chaotic weeks of the Vietnam War to, more recently, corporate safety failures at Boeing, earning her an Academy Award nomination and multiple Emmy wins along the way. In 2012, she made a documentary about her own mother's life, simply titled Ethel, premiering it at the Sundance Film Festival and turning the family's private history into a piece of work entirely on her own terms rather than anyone else's, fittingly, given how her own life began. Several of her films return again and again to the same themes that shaped her childhood without her realizing it: institutions failing ordinary people, and the quiet cost of decisions made far above the heads of the people who have to live with them. It's worth pausing here on something people who follow this family closely have pointed to for decades, a pattern often referred to, half seriously, as the Kennedy curse, the idea that sudden, public tragedy seems to visit this particular family more often than ordinary statistical chance would predict. Whatever you make of that framing, the family absorbed 2 more losses in the grandchildren's generation just a year apart. In 2019, Courtney's daughter Sharsh, the very child born out of her marriage to Paul Hill, died of an accidental overdose at the family's Cape Cod compound at just 22 years old. The following spring, in 2020, Kathleen's daughter Maeve drowned in the Chesapeake Bay along with her own 8-year-old son Gideon after the 2 of them canoed out to retrieve a ball and were caught by winds they couldn't paddle back against. 2 losses, a full generation removed from David and Michael, arriving within a year of each other. Each one just as sudden and just as impossible to grieve outside the public eye as the ones that came before. Between these 6 siblings, an entire second version of the family's original mission has quietly continued, just without the headlines that followed their more visible brothers. Here's a quick reminder before we get to where all 11 of them stand today. If stories like this one are the kind you find yourself genuinely drawn to, hitting subscribe means you won't miss the next one. It helps more than you might think, and it takes about 2 seconds. Now, back to the family. On October 10th, 2024, Ethel Kennedy died at the age of 96 after complications from a stroke she had suffered the week before. In a statement released at the time, her daughter Carrie wrote that the family was comforted knowing their mother was reunited with the love of her life, our father, Robert F. Kennedy, along with 2 of her own children who had gone before her, David and Michael, and 2 grandchildren the family had also lost far too young. She had spent 56 years raising 11 children essentially alone, running a household that somehow absorbed every triumph and every tragedy this particular family produced. And by the time she died, she left behind 34 grandchildren carrying pieces of that legacy forward in nearly every direction imaginable. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, now in her 70s, remains connected to family philanthropic work, decades removed from her time as Maryland's lieutenant governor, and has continued speaking publicly about her father's legacy at events tied to his memory. Joseph Kennedy, in his early 70s himself, stays largely out of elected politics today, focused on business and charitable ventures. Having quietly closed the book on the governor's race that never happened, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. continues serving as U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services, still at the center of one of the most closely watched and most argued about jobs in the entire federal government, regularly testifying before Congress on everything from vaccine policy to food regulation to his department's budget. Courtney lives quietly, connected to human rights causes tied to Ireland, largely out of the public eye except when her daughter's memory is invoked. Carrie continues leading the human rights organization that carries her father's name, still writing and speaking on political prisoners and human rights abuses around the world. Christopher remains active in Chicago business and anti-hunger philanthropy, having stepped back from electoral politics after his 2018 run. Matthew continues to live almost entirely outside public view, the one sibling whose adult life remains genuinely difficult to piece together from public records. Douglas continues working in journalism, more than a decade removed from the hospital case that briefly made him a tabloid fixture. And Rory keeps making documentaries, most recently premiering new work at the same festival where her film about her own mother first debuted over a decade ago, still turning difficult institutional stories into the kind of work that earns awards attention year after year. Between the 9 of them still living, and the 34 grandchildren who came after, several of whom have already stepped into their own careers in law, politics, and activism, the Kennedy name today runs in almost every direction a family name can run: government office, human rights law, business, journalism, film, federal health policy, and quiet private life far from any of it. It is, depending entirely on which sibling or which grandchild you happen to be looking at in a given year, either the most visible family name in the country or one you'd never notice at all. It's tempting, Looking back at old footage of this family from the 1960s, all those children lined up for photographs on the lawn at Hickory Hill. Their father tossing one of them into a swimming pool while cameras clicked away, to imagine that their story was always going to be one long, unbroken narrative of politics and privilege. But somewhere behind those photographs, 11 children were doing homework, burying two of their own brothers decades apart, building law practices and film careers in grocery delivery charities, sitting through congressional hearings and custody battles and Vatican appeals, and quietly deciding, each in their own time, exactly how much of their parents' world they wanted to carry forward into their own lives. A daughter born on the 4th of July grew up to become the first woman to hold statewide office in her state, then watched her own daughter taken from her far too soon, just as her mother once was. A son who spent years fighting addiction lost his closest sibling to the same fight, then decades later found himself running one of the largest health agencies in the country. A job that puts him, quite literally, in charge of the exact systems that failed his own brother. A daughter who married a man once wrongly imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, spent her adult life quietly working for people the world had already decided to forget about. And a daughter, born after her father was already gone, spent her career making films about people whose stories, like her father's own final chapter, ended before the world was finished with them. Some of the 11 carried almost all of their parents' world forward with them. A few carried almost none of it, at least not in any way the public could easily see. One carried it directly into the very center of American government, for better or worse, depending entirely on who you ask, and depending on which policy story is making headlines the week you happen to be watching this. A mother who buried a husband to violence and two sons to very different kinds of tragedy somehow raised 9 other children who built lives spanning nearly every corner of American public and private life there is. Elected office, federal government, human rights law, business, journalism, documentary film, and a version of quiet, ordinary privacy that, for a family with this particular last name, may have been the hardest achievement of all. Given everything this family has lived through across 3 generations now, it's hard not to see that alone as its own kind of legacy, whatever else history eventually decides to say about the rest of it. And please subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and which of these 11 stories surprised you most.